Hey there, it is Mr. K. Welcome back to the next AP Lit lecture. Today we are talking about or continuing to talk about identifying and explaining the function of point of view in a narrative. So what we're going to do in this lesson is help you closely read a piece of short fiction and examine how the first person point of view shapes the beginning of the narrative. So our goals today, we're trying to understand, actually 3 goals: understand first person point of view, how to recognize it, then understand why first person point of view is important, and understand the limitations of first person point of view. My guess is that if you are watching this, you are in an AP Lit class, you likely know how to pick up first person point of view and how to recognize it. You could probably answer that question right now. Excellent. That's great. The second and the third might be a little more nuanced and something maybe you haven't thought through or been taught yet. And so understanding how first person point of view is important and understanding the limitations of person point of view, also one of our main goals today. And again, we're something I'm saying in these beginning lectures is this: you've likely learned first person point of view, but then that question of if a teacher or someone were to ask you, okay, so you know this story is in first person point of view, how does that point of view actually function? You might be like, well, I know it's first person point of view because X, Y, and Z, right? And they say, no, I know it's first person point of view, and I know you know how to pick that out. Why does that matter, though? How does that actually affect the story? That is a harder question. It's just not one that people are typically really well versed in how to answer that. And so that's what our job is. Okay, so first person point of view. The person telling the story is a character in the story. It may be the protagonist relaying their experiences or a peripheral character telling the protagonist's story. Either way, the last lecture talked about the narrator framing a story. A first person point of view means that narrator is inside the frame. They are either the main character experiencing the events themselves, or they are a character who they themselves are also within the frame, and they are recalling events of another character. How do we know it's first person? Like I said, this is likely review, but the narrator will refer to himself or herself as I, and they use pronouns like we, me, and us. Okay? So, and if you didn't know that until now, that's also fine. Right? But when when the narrator is first person, they're saying, I saw this. We experienced this. This happened to me. Right? It happened to us. They themselves are in the story. All right. Here is an excerpt from a phenomenal story called Cathedral by Raymond Carver. If you haven't read this story, for the purposes of our conversation right now, that's actually okay. This excerpt, you'll still be able to see first person at work, and we'll be able to talk through why first person is important and also how it's limited in a lot of ways. Okay, so if you're like, I don't know what's happening in the story, that's okay. All right, so here is the excerpt that I want to share with you. It says this: This blind man, an old friend of my wife's, he was on his way to spend the night. His wife had died, so he was visiting the dead wife's relatives in Connecticut. He called my wife from his in-laws. Arrangements were made. He would come by train, a 5-hour trip, and my wife would meet him at the station. She hadn't seen him since she worked for him one summer in Seattle 10 years ago, but she and the blind man had kept in touch. They made tapes and mailed them back and forth. I wasn't enthusiastic about his visit. He was no one I knew, and his being blind bothered me. My idea of blindness came from the movies. In the movies, the blind moved slowly and never laughed. Sometimes they were led by seeing eye dogs. A blind man in my house was not something I looked forward to. Okay. So let's start here. How do we know that's first person? Well, the language used is words like my several times, I a few times, my idea, I looked forward to. So, excuse me. So this narrator in this story is very much a part of the action. Now, notice he's recalling, information about his wife and the friend's wife who had died, and the wife's relatives. Just because the narrator is recalling the story, and that story includes other people, doesn't throw it off from first person. It's like if I was telling a story to my wife at the end of the day, and I said, "Yeah, Izzy and I, my daughter, excuse me, my daughter and I, we went to the store, and at the store, I ran into our friend Kyle, who I haven't seen in a while, et cetera, et cetera." Yeah, in that story, my daughter is in the story, and my friend Kyle is in the story, right? But I'm the one telling the events. I'm using first person point of view. All right, so that's how you that is how you identify first person. Now, a little bit more complex is how to actually look for the strengths and weaknesses that first person perspective gives us. Well, here's an idea that we need to notice. The first person point of view in this case shows both bias and power. It shows bias that this narrator has toward blind people for whatever reason, right? And he even says, my idea of blindness came from the movies. In the movies, the blind moved slowly and never laughed, et cetera, et cetera. That's bias that they have toward blind people. And there's also this power dynamic. This narrator is even indirectly in some ways, but asserting power, saying, I do not look forward to this visit. Asserting themselves in the events that are taking place. And so one thing that we need to take away from this is that first person, while there are many, many strengths, which we'll talk about in a moment, there are weaknesses, and they can be bias, power, right? I used the story last lecture, but if a bystander witnessed a mugging, but that bystander, is giving their statement to a police officer, and that bystander happens to have a personal vendetta for whatever reason against the person who got mugged, their bias might come into play. They may say, well, it wasn't really a mugging as much as it was like an altercation, a brawl between the two. The person who got mugged was kind of egging on the mugger, like, what, that didn't happen, but their personal bias is coming into play. All right. And if there's this kind of power dynamic, like changing or somehow presenting the events in a narrative in a certain way, that is a form of power. Right? The narrator, we talked about this last lecture, but there is power. The narrator has that power. And the narrator is setting up this blind man for us. Whether or not you agree with him is not really the question. It's, we're like, okay, is there some reason that this blind man is not worth trusting? Is this foreshadowing for some reason? You're like, you start questioning. And why are you questioning? Because the narrator spoke in such a way that prompted us to question. So here's the importance of a first-person point of view. It develops a kind of intimacy. Now, that word intimacy is loaded because you think like romantic intimacy. No, not necessarily. It's this story, this excerpt here. There is an intimacy in that this narrator is speaking to us directly, right? And well, that would be second person point of view. But they it's almost like they're sitting there telling us their story, and we're just sitting beside them listening. There is a closeness that develops, in hearing a person's story. It gives credibility to a first person point of view. This person was actually there. They actually saw the mugging happen. Or this man is talking about his own wife and, this friend from the past. Well, we start to think, well, obviously I'm going to trust them because, they were there and they saw it happen. Right. And it expresses an opinion. More opinionated pieces are going to typically be written in first person because they are personal. They are highly personal, and usually, so those are the strengths, the importance of first person point of view. Here are some limitations. Right, we talked about bias, and I've mentioned this before, but reliability. If the narrator, the first person narrator, is talking to us, and we have some reason to maybe doubt is a little strong. Maybe question whether or not they're reliable. Question like, are you sure it happened that way? Or do you feel this way because this character wronged you in the past? Or we start to question a first person narrator's reliability, right? And so bias and reliability can be problematic. All right. Quotes like this. I wasn't enthusiastic. This is that first person narrator from the piece. I wasn't enthusiastic about his visit. His being blind bothered me. A blind man in my house was not something I looked forward to. Personally, now I, as the reader, am coming to this, with my own life experiences, but I'm thinking, gosh, this narrator, at least based on this excerpt, sounds awful. Being blind bothered you? A blind man in your house was not something you look forward to? Gosh, who are you? That sounds awful. So now I am kind of asserting my own power against the narrator. I'm asserting my power and the narrator's asserting theirs. And that's what literature does, is it gives us the chance for those two things to face and see what happens, But those are, to me, that shows limitations within a first person point of view. So a main takeaway is this. If you were to kind of look at a positive and a negative first person point of view, it does allow for intimacy, a closeness between a narrator and an audience, but it also can contain, and often does contain, bias of some kind. Right. So today's goals: to understand what first person point of view is, how to recognize it, and then understand first person point of view, why it's important, and understand its limitations. I hope this was helpful for you, and I will see you next time.